Hello again, Ledgewood Baptist Church. Good morning. Welcome to the midweek video for the reading for week 17, April 16 through 22. And our reading this week is 1 Samuel 25 through 31, and then 2 Samuel 1 through 4, Psalms 56, 121, 40 through 142, 17, 35, 54, 63, 18, 121, 123 through 125, 128 through 30, 6, 8 through 10, 14, 16, 19, and 21. I will not be covering all of these psalms. That is many psalms. But this week's reading takes us through the death of Samuel and basically the end of an era. It takes us through Saul's continued pursuit of David, David's defection to the Philistines, Saul's death, and then David's 7-year reign over Judah in Hebron, along with the ongoing civil war between Saul's family and David that happens afterwards. So in 1 Samuel 25, Samuel dies and all of Israel mourns him. It's really interesting that Samuel dies without seeing God fulfill the promise of putting David on the throne, but God still keeps his promise. So we can actually add Samuel to the list of witnesses in Hebrews 11 who all died without seeing the promises fulfilled in their lifetimes. But we see that, God keeps promises after death all the time because he's that kind of faithful. We can die, but he still sees those promises as being alive. And so then we see that the story then pivots swiftly from the death of Samuel up in Ramah and his burial to Maon/Carmel, that territory. So that's about 25 miles south of that area. So everybody's mourning Samuel up north, and then David's down 25 miles south, just traveling around the area of Carmel and actually looking after the flocks and herds of this guy Nabal while they're shearing his sheep. And so it's kind of a feast time. And so David arrives there with his men on a feast day. And so he actually sends a couple of people out to Nabal and says, hey, we're in the area. We've been taking care of your sheep. You can count them. We've been really honorable. Would you set us up this feast day and let us participate? And I mean, this would be a big burden on his hospitality. David has 400 men, but then Nabal's like a really rich guy. He's got over 3,000 sheep. He can handle it. Also, culturally, if you're this rich, it actually just shows the honor of your house if you're willing to put this many people up. It shows your capacity for greatness and your capacity for generosity. So we see that Nabal is actually a very small-souled man. What we also see in his response is that he says to David, I don't know who David is. I don't know who the son of Jesse is. There are lots of servants in Israel these days who leave their masters. And so we see a couple of things happening here because is this the story that Saul's putting out? This is doubly unjust because not only did David not betray Saul, Saul betrayed David. David only left Saul because Saul was so intent on trying to kill him. David has only ever been faithful to Saul. And actually, even in the previous chapter, he swore an oath to Saul that he was never going to touch him or his house. So honestly, I think I can kind of understand why David's like, let's get some swords and let's solve this. So Nabal's servants, they hear that David's coming. He's got these 400 men with all their swords on. And so they go back, and they don't go back to Nabal to fix the situation because Nabal, we've already seen, is a man who tends to escalate things. He's not a man who's wise. Instead, they go to Abigail. Abigail is the more reasonable and the more perceptive of the two. So when they go to her, she ends up coming out with an offering to David, brings him a bunch of food, and comes out to make peace. She names Nabal for the fool that he is. And she, just shows that she's come out to make peace with David and to recognize that David, is in the right, that David didn't deserve this kind of treatment. And she actually invites David to consider her as if she were guilty instead of Nabal. So we actually learn a lot about Abigail. And I would just say, reread her words, because what can we observe about her view of God from the things that she says about God? What kind of imagery does she even use when she communicates with David? Because she talks about a sling, and it's very interesting how wise she is and how well she communicates. We also see that, God's given her this kind of perceptiveness, and she's able to say, we know you're going to be the king. Is she making a prophecy, or is she just recognizing God at work? So, I think we can see in this story that the most spiritually perceptive person in the room is actually Abigail. And how does God use her to save lives? How does he use her to stand between these two, angry and unyielding men? Also, what do we see about in verse 36? What do we see Nabal doing this whole time? He's still gone ahead and gone to the feast, not worried about who he's insulted. And he's gotten himself so blind drunk she can't even talk to him. So when she finally tells him the next day, that he could have died, he actually probably has a stroke, and then 10 days later, God kills him. And so we see just a lot about this man. And it's also interesting that, again, we've got a story where, a woman in Israel is the most spiritually astute person in the place. It's a lot like, Deborah back in the day. It's like Ruth and Naomi. It's like Hannah. Guys are running around doing a bunch of craziness. And then here's the woman, and they're just like spiritually in tune with God, which is kind of neat. And so we see then that David takes her as a wife, and he also takes another lady as a wife at the same time. But he takes Abigail as a wife because she's not going to have anybody to defend her or take care of her after Nabal dies. But this also ought to be sending us some red flags, like from Deuteronomy 17:14 through 20, which again is what the kings are supposed to do. Here's this thing: don't take a lot of wives, because if you take a lot of wives, it's going to turn your heart away from the living God. And so anybody who's thinking about being a king should probably have read Deuteronomy 17 and have thought, there's some things I'm not supposed to do. Maybe taking extra wives is one of them. So we see something that's starting to just sort of creep into David's life, and it's going to have consequences in the future, even if at this moment it's actually an altruistic thing to do. He's taking care of her, and it's culturally acceptable because he's a powerful man, and powerful men in those times, and many other times in the world, collect women. So we also see even now that Psalm 63 may pop up in this time in David's life. So then moving on, in chapter 26, we have a second opportunity for David to kill Saul. You remember in chapter 24, Saul goes into a cave to relieve himself, and while he's there, David sneaks up and cuts off a corner of his robe, and then feels bad about it, apologizes to him, shows him the corner of his robe, and then actually, comes to Saul and puts his neck down where Saul could kill him. And Saul has him swear not to destroy Saul's family. Saul recognizes that David's going to be king, and so Saul even says, I'm not going to do anything to you. Well, that didn't last. So we see how useful Saul's word is and how trustworthy it is, because now Saul comes out against David again with his whole army. And you see that they end up out camping at night, and Abner, Saul's bodyguard, falls asleep, and David's there, sees it, has another opportunity to kill Saul. Instead, he takes his spear in his cup, and he walks off to the mountain, and he's like, "Hey, Abner, what you been sleeping for?" And so what we see again here is that David has a second opportunity to solve a God-sized problem in a human way. And even all of the people who are counseling around him say, God has obviously given this man into your hands. And what you can see is circumstantially, it looks like God may have delivered him into his hands. But at the same time, God said God was going to elevate David. And at this time, Saul is still the Lord's anointed. And so David doesn't see himself as having any right to kill this man. And so you see, again, here's David who is making a decision based on what God told him, and not making a decision based on what he sees. So we see Saul, he says, I've sinned. Return my son David. I will harm you no more, because my life was precious in your eyes this day. I have played the fool, and I've erred exceedingly. And it's repentance, but David's still, at this point, not going to trust it, not a great track record. So David says, I actually have to get out of Israel. What we see David doing, again, is actually really much more kingly than anything Saul's done, because David leaves Israel instead of continuing to bring war into his own people. He's saving his own skin, but he's also saving all of the people around him who are being put in danger by the way that Saul is fighting. And so you see him defect to the Philistines and continue to protect and fight for his people even as he's defecting. And so there's this real love for his people. And so then he actually goes to the Philistines. And at this time we get a little bit of a clue as to the date for when this book was compiled / written / edited. Because it says in 27:6, so Achish gave him Ziklag that day. Therefore Ziklag has belonged to the kings of Judah to this day. So that gives us this textual clue that this text was compiled sometime after the kingdom had divided after Solomon, and before it had been before Israel had been taken by Assyria in 722 BC, and then certainly before Judah had been taken in 586 BC. So we get a little bit of a clue as to the dating, that this is being compiled sometime in the reign of the kings in the southern kingdom of Judah. So that's just interesting. That's free. We also see at this time that David, he's raiding Israel's enemies, but then he's pretending like he's raiding Israel. So he's continuing to protect his people, even as he is preserving his own life in Gath of the Philistines. And then you see this contrast with Saul, because Saul actively allowed, even the priests and all their children and babies to be killed by Doeg the Edomite in his pursuit of David. But David, in running away from Saul, refuses to even go against any of his people. And so there's just this loyalty difficulty there. We can also see that at this time, Psalm 56 may fit in this time for David. Psalm 35 would also fit very well contextually, as David is asking God to fight for him instead of David fighting for himself. So moving forward, chapters 28 and 31, they bring us the downfall of Saul. And then 29 and 30 are kind of just a little window into like what's happening in the Philistines, kind of a meanwhile and Ziklag kind of a situation. So in chapter 28, 3, we see Saul's claim to fame over his kingdom. And it says that specifically that Saul had put out all of the mediums and the spiritists from the land. So what is the biggest accomplishment that Saul has made for his kingdom, where he was actually doing something God was telling him to do? He's gotten the mediums and spiritists out of the land. That's setting us up for the rest of the chapter. And this is going to be really pointed, especially because of the way Samuel rebuked Saul in chapter 15, verses 22 through 23. Because Samuel said, "Has the Lord as great a delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed than the fat of rams. For rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft, and stubbornness is as iniquity and idolatry." And what do you think we could use to characterize basically all of Saul's reign? Rebellion and stubbornness. And so the things that he was doing that are equated in Samuel's eyes to witchcraft actually come full circle, where Saul is actually participating in witchcraft himself. And so we see that in all of this time, Saul's been fighting David, not the Philistines. Philistines have gotten big enough to confront Saul and take him down. And he sees them, he sees their threat, and then he finally goes and starts to ask God for help. But God is not answering him at this point, because Saul's like burned that bridge. So God's not answering him. He's trying to get dreams. He's trying to talk to the priests. He's trying to talk to prophets, to the Urim and the Thummim, which were the stones from Moses' day. And he's getting no answer from God. So he's finally desperate. So he seeks out a medium and finds this lady who's a medium in the place of Endor and greets her, and he goes in secret, like she's not going to be able to tell, and she's like, "It's Saul!" And she pulls up Samuel's spirit, and Samuel's spirit says, "You're going to die, and this is going to be the end for Saul." And so it's just a really, really sad ending from someone who began with so much promise. And then meanwhile in Ziklag, the lords of the Philistines are drawing up battle plans, and they don't want David to come fight with them against Israel. So we see Achish the king, he sends David back home to Ziklag. And then how is God sparing David in the circumstances? I mean, can you imagine if you were David and it was about to be a war against your own people and you're willing to go to battle, but how's that going to go for you? So how's God sparing David from so much pain in the future with this, even though David may not see it? So David goes back in chapter 30 to Ziklag. He finds out the Amalekites, who shouldn't be alive, have invaded and carried everyone away, including David's 2 wives. So he responds by speaking to Abiathar, consulting God, and God guides him in how to get his people back. We also see the story of this Egyptian servant who was left for dead, which teaches us a lot about the Amalekite view of people. And also, this Saul was supposed to kill all these people. So how do we still see the ripple effect of Saul's earlier incomplete obedience to the Lord still coming out with consequences for his people? And so this is not cool. And so we also see David introduce a new custom in the wake of his victory about sharing the spoils of war. So what does this teach us about him? It's kind of cool. And then in 31, we get an abbreviated report of Saul and the Philistines in their battle. We see that Saul dies, his sons die, including Jonathan. We also see Saul ends up actually committing suicide because he's mortally wounded, but he doesn't want the Philistines to abuse him, so he has his armor bearer run him through with his sword. And then they do take his body and they cut his head off and string him up. And so people actually have to come and rescue his body. So it's just a really terrible, terrible ending to Israel's first king. So this moves us into 2 Samuel, which originally these 2 books were one book, but they were cut in half, probably to have smaller scrolls, because it's a big scroll. So David receives a report of Saul's death, and then he kills the Amalekite who takes credit for killing Saul. Also interesting, it's an Amalekite, supposed to be dead. This kind of brings up the question, was the armor bearer and the Amalekite, were those different people? Were they the same person? Or did the Amalekite just sort of see the armor bearer do his thing, and then the Amalekite rushed in, took the crown, and then thought, I'm going to take the credit, David's going to treat me well for this? Either way, it doesn't go well for him. We see David continuing to just display the same ethic of, why did you touch the Lord's anointed? Like the thing that David wasn't going to do. He refused to kill Saul. He refused to have Saul killed by other people, which would be indirect. And now here's this man who claims to have killed Saul, and David has him put to death for touching the Lord's anointed. So we still see some of this like loyalty from David's oath in chapter 24 of 1 Samuel. Another interesting thing that we see textually is in 2 Samuel 1:18. It mentions that these things are also included in the book of Jasher, which means there was another older textual source that was available at that time that has not survived to this time. So they did have older sources of history that they were using to do research and compile their new histories. So that's pretty interesting, because we do see the importance of like extra texts in compiling histories, and they did too. So then in chapter 2, 2 Samuel, David goes up to Hebron according to God's instructions. Hebron was one of the cities of refuge. So why do you think it's significant that God sent him to Hebron to rule for 7 years over the tribe of Judah? We also see how cheap life is in this civil war. So you have like Joab and Abner, and they get their dudes, and there's all the dudes grabbing the beards and like shoving the swords in the other dudes. I mean, it's just such a cheap like game of life. And just taking lives. There's this like weird sort of medieval view of your enemies and their honor, and then like David's own people are just as bloodthirsty as Saul's people everywhere, and sometimes even more so, especially Joab. We see some ancient politics between Ishbosheth and Abner, and how quickly loyalties can change. And then we see David's multiplication of wives in 3:5. It specifically lists how many wives, how many sons. So he had 6 sons by 6 different women in his 7 years in Hebron, and we know this isn't going to end well. There's a lot of foreshadowing there. He also has Michal, Saul's daughter, physically taken from her new husband who actually loves her, and then taken back to his harem. And so we see this sort of sneaking into David's life. We also see the introduction of Jonathan's son Mephibosheth, who's going to come into the story later. And then we see the death of Ishbosheth, Saul's son, which David repays with the blood of the people who killed him again. So again, it's just that loyalty to Saul's family, which Saul didn't show to him, but David was still faithful even though Saul was faithless. So some observations from this. Saul gave up everything he had to try to get rid of David. He spent so much time chasing David, who was not his enemy, that he left his country vulnerable to the Philistines and allowed them to grow into an army big enough to take him down, which ultimately cost the lives of his people, his sons, his own self. He lost his kingdom, his family, and the friendship he could have had with David, who loved him deeply, from 1 Samuel 16 through 16:21. And because of Saul's choices, David lost years of his life running around in the wilderness, and he lost his best friend. Saul's desperate rebellion against God had a ripple effect of loss and civil war for years to come. He was so focused on one person he perceived to be his enemy that he couldn't see all of the blessings that God had given him: a family, kingdom, power, influence, the ability to lead and deliver God's people. He couldn't see the blessing he could be to others. So it's a tremendous blindness, and none of us are immune. It's just this short-term thinking. And one of the terrible aspects of Saul's life is that he's so powerful that nobody is able to tell him no. We also see a slow creep into David's life of seeing women as collectibles. So there's a blindness here as well. And this may be, culturally normative for a man in power, but it's still going to cost him a lot at the end as well. So this should be scary to us. We all need to be asking God and other people to point out things that they see creeping into our lives that we can't see from the inside. And then also, life is cheap in the kingdom era. We see Israel begin to fight itself and not just its enemies. Was life meant to be like this for God's people? This looks again like Judges. And then also, how long has it taken for God's promises to David when he was a young man to start to be seen coming true in David's life? So how does that make us think about, how does God deal with time? How does he treat his promises in our lives? So this week, a lot of heavy reading, a lot of heavy stories. Looking forward to discussing with you on Sunday, and I hope this has been helpful, and you guys have a great week.